The Allied bombing campaign of World War II has been one of the more controversial aspects of the war, most notably the raid on the city of Dresden. Some people have called it a tragedy, a crime against humanity. Personally, I like to call it a skill issue. The destruction of Dresden has been used as a sob story for the Third Reich as proof that the wrong side won the war, specifically used by the pseudo-historian David Irving, who looks like he shouldn't be allowed within 20 kilometers of a school. While the bombing was certainly horrific, that doesn't mean you can get away with using it to defend some of the 20th century's worst scumbags. In this video, we'll be looking at Dresden before the war, during the war, and after its destruction. So, instead of wasting time, let us begin. I'm sure most of you are aware that Dresden had a reputation for being a place of culture, and it certainly was. The city was absolutely beautiful, with its famous buildings that were constructed in the Baroque style, drawing in many tourists from all over the world, especially Britain. The city was home to the Semper Opera House, the Saraceni Circus, which brought performers in from all over the world, the Frauenkirche Church, and many other things. There was also no shortage of talent. The city had a choir called the Dresdner Kreuzchor, which was directed by Rudolf Meyersberger. There were also painters, many of them following the modernist style, such as Otto Griebel and Otto Dix. Unfortunately, it's now the 1930s, and Germany is about to go through their edgy phase. When the inbred cunt from Austria took over, Dresden was put under the command of Gauleiter Martin Muchmann. To put it lightly, he was a cunt. For such a cultured city, Dresden was quick to adopt the authoritarian policies of the Nazis. Obviously, freedom of expression is a very dangerous thing, so Uncle Adolf started cracking down. Aside from basic civil liberties, other stuff such as art was also censored. Many artists, particularly modernist artists such as Otto and Otto, had their work publicly shamed for being immoral. The irony in the Nazis calling something immoral is just absolutely fucking hilarious. Personally, I like to believe that the bad Austrian painter was just jealous of more talented artists. I wish I could say that the bad things ended here, but for those deemed undesirable by the Führer, their problems were only just beginning. In Dresden, there lived a little over 6,000 Jews, whom would now be brutalized by the new authorities. Aside from having their properties and possessions stolen, they also had their places of faith destroyed. During Kristallnacht, the Jewish synagogue that was designed by Gottfried Semper, the same architect who built the Opera House, was set on fire by Nazi supporters. Surprisingly, the local fire department was quick to respond, but were blocked by SS thugs. Only when the flames had destroyed most of the structure were the firemen allowed to do their job. Just like the rest of them throughout Germany, the Jewish population were forced to pay for the damages caused that night. As time went on, most of them were deported out of the city. You can guess what happened to them, though I am sure some of you will deny it. David Irving. Interestingly, not all of them were deported. Victor Klemperer, a Jewish university student who was married to a German woman named Eva, was fired from his job and forced out of his house. Just like the rest of Dresden's surviving Jews, he and his wife were forced to live in designated apartments called Judenhäuser, which were old and decrepit, not really nice places to live. While conditions had worsened severely, the Jews of Dresden did occasionally receive acts of kindness from their German compatriots. When the war started, Dresden remained mostly untouched. Just like many other cities, Dresden's factories began producing materials for the war effort. To give an example, the Zeiss Icon factory was dedicated to producing precision instruments and optics for the Air Force, Army, and Navy. With so many young German men being sent on Uncle Adolf's bizarre adventure, the jobs in these factories were relegated to slave labor. Allied POWs found their way into the city, with the most famous one I can think of being the future American novelist Kurt Vonnegut. Many Jews, such as Klemperer, and Slavic peoples from Poland and the USSR, found themselves working tirelessly for the Nazi war machine. The conditions that they lived in were horrible. The lack of caleffaction, food, and rest was soul-crushing for these people. And it wasn't like this was kept a secret. Regular workers from Dresden would come into these very same places every day. According to Klemperer, these workers were rather kind, or, at the very least, didn't do anything mean to them. It's almost like they realized that Nazism was a bad thing, yet they didn't really do much about it. Not only were forced laborers obligated to produce stuff for the war effort, but also simpler, more elegant things as well. Prior to the war, Dresden was well known for its porcelain, having been one of the first European cities to perfect its production. Dresden's porcelain found its way into many households, especially in Britain. Unfortunately, the Nazis also took interest in it, and, like everything they touched, covered it in blood. A porcelain workshop was set up in the Dachau concentration camp, where its victims were forced to produce these fine pieces of art under threat of execution. To those who honestly believe that Dresden was a place of culture and civilization, it most certainly wasn't, or at least under the Nazis, that is. In my humble opinion, wartime Dresden was the perfect representation of fascism. Sure, it may look pretty with its tidy streets and stylish old buildings, but under its facade of civility lies all the horrors committed by the Nazis, and it wouldn't be long till its ugly interior began to resemble its exterior.
There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. Germany, clinging more and more desperately to her widespread conquests, and even seeking foolishly for more, will make a most interesting initial experiment. Japan will provide the confirmation. But the time is not yet. There is a great deal of work to be done first, and let us all get down to it.
Before World War II even began, the large-scale bombings of cities was not unheard of. The most notable example that I can think of occurred during the Spanish Civil War, when a combined force of Italian and German aircraft bombed the Spanish city of Guernica, an event that was later immortalized in a painting by Pablo Picasso. The bombing of major population centers wasn't only meant to cause destruction, but also to weaken the enemy's will to fight. During the invasion of Poland, the Germans attempted to force Warsaw to surrender by bombing the hell out of it. The Poles, however, were not persuaded, and it would take the Germans 2 extra days to defeat them. There was then the infamous bombing of Rotterdam. Similar to Warsaw, the Germans tried to use fear by threatening to destroy the city, which they did. In this case, the Dutch government actually surrendered in an attempt to avoid further damage and suffering. After the fall of France, there was then the Blitz, which saw the German Luftwaffe bomb British cities. As we all know, this was not enough to break the will of the Brits, who would go on to fight the war till its end. With the German defeat in the Battle of Britain and the American entry in the war, the battle for the skies began to favor the Allies. Enter Sir Arthur Harris, or as I like to call him, Bomber Send the Huns to the Sun Harris. The best way I can describe Sir Arthur, Killer of Huns Harris, was that he was coldly pragmatic. In 1942, he stated in a conference that he had no interest in reprisals against Germany and only wanted to bring the war to a quick end. If I'm not mistaken, one German officer once quoted as saying, "The most humane war is a quick one." Irving would probably have you believe that he was just a brute that probably ate little German kids for breakfast. Sinclair Mckay, whose book I've been using extensively in this video, points out another factor that may have motivated Sir Arthur airborne cremation of the Aryan nation Harris, and that is the casualties suffered by the RAF. Before the war had even reached its halfway point, over 50,000 airmen of the RAF had perished. If you have ever picked up a history book, which I'm sure some of you haven't, you're probably aware of the fear that these men felt flying deep into Germany under heavy fire. I've read one account of a Lancaster bomber being blown to bits mid-air, with the bloody remains of its crew hitting the windshield of a nearby aircraft. In 1942, when Sir Arthur Blitz Fritz Harris became head of the RAF Bomber Command, he managed to convince British Prime Minister Winston Churchill that the bombings of German cities was as vital to the war effort as any other front. Aside from destroying German industries, one of the objectives of the Allied bombing campaign was to destroy the enemy's morale. Now before we continue, I just want to say that this is stupid. As seen multiple times during history, the bombing of cities almost never breaks the enemy's will to fight. The British should have known this, especially after their own experience during the Blitz. However, it appears that this option was still on the table. As seen during the bombing of Hamburg in 1943, which killed a record 40,000 civilians, the event did little to make the Germans come to their senses that maybe the war just wasn't worth fighting for. Aside from the death toll and the destruction of industries, the most astonishing thing about the bombing of Hamburg was the firestorm that came after. Hamburg wasn't the first to experience this phenomenon. Earlier in the war, the British city of Coventry was targeted with incendiary bombs by the Germans. The Krauts even coined a new word, Coventrieren, to raise a city to the ground. While Coventry was the first, it most certainly would not be the last. Sir Arthur, doing my rounds of 9,000 pounds Harris, had a certain fascination with incendiary bombs, viewing their potential to create firestorms as devastatingly effective. At the end of the war, he even claimed that they were more devastating than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. By 1943, many individuals in the Allied air forces began to demand better specification for their objectives. It was decided that oil refineries and rail junctions would take priority. However, putting these facilities out of commission was rather difficult, either due to AA fire, enemy fighters, and even meteorological conditions. As a result, the damage done was minimal, and the casualties they received was high. On top of this, civilian casualties also remained high. In 1944, the Allies launched Operation Thunder against Berlin. Its objective was not to bomb specific targets, but the city itself in an attempt to break the morale of the German people, who were seen as instruments of the Nazi war machine. The attack on Berlin is a good example of this total war mentality that characterized World War II. The Axis, just like the Allies, didn't just mobilize an army, but an entire nation. Like, for fuck's sakes, the most infamous speech of the Third Reich was Joseph Goebbels' total war discourse about mobilizing the home front for the war effort. And now, this is when Dresden comes into play.
Cologne, Lubeck, Rostock, those are only just the beginning. We cannot send 1,000 bombers a time over Germany every time as yet. But the time will come when we can do so. Let the Nazis take good note of the western horizon. There they will see a cloud as yet no bigger than a man's hand. But behind that cloud lies the whole massive power of the United States of America.
Contrary to Nazi propaganda, Dresden had not gone untouched by the Allies. The first attack against the city was perpetrated by the 8th American Air Force. On October 7, 1944, American B-24s flew over Dresden in broad daylight. Their target was the train station just east of the Altstadt. As with many other cases, there were plenty of bombs that missed their targets, instead landing in civilian areas. In total, 270 people lost their lives during the attack. For many people in Dresden, this was their first real introduction to war. While the damage and death were low for World War II standards, the event still horrified them. The next attack occurred on the 16th of January, 1945, aimed at the city's rail infrastructure. Karl Spaatz, the commander of the US Air Force, was adamant on striking Dresden's rail network in an attempt to cut off the city's communication with Berlin and the rest of the Eastern Front. By 1945, Germany was in the process of getting railed by the Allies. To the east, the First Ukrainian Front under Ivan Konev was advancing through Poland in the direction of Dresden. It is here where the Soviets come onto the stage. As I'm sure most of you are aware, the Soviets requested the city to be bombed to help with their advance through Germany. Mr. Cuntface over here says that this is untrue, claiming that the Western Allies and Stalin never signed an agreement during the Yalta Conference. Besides, the Soviets would go on to claim that they had no involvement in this, and they even used the bombing as anti-Western propaganda. While it appears that they didn't sign any document to specifically bomb Dresden, the Soviet High Command did request that the Western Allies bomb the city. Hugh Lungi, I think that's how you pronounce it, who was present during the Yalta Conference, said in an interview that General Antonov, the Soviet Deputy Chief of Staff, emphasized that he didn't want German reinforcements from the Western Front in Italy to use Dresden's rail network for transport. Thus, he asked them to bomb it. As we all know by now, Dresden was contributing to the Nazi war effort. And it wasn't just their factories and rail lines. Being so close to the front lines, Dresden had a sizable garrison, made up of troops from the Wehrmacht, Volkssturm, Hitler Youths, and Waffen-SS. There was, however, a lack of anti-air defenses, since the Germans had prioritized other parts of the front. Another thing that was lacking was adequate bomb shelters for the populace. Since Dresden had barely been bombed, Gauleiter Munchmann deemed it unnecessary to provide the city's shelters with proper ventilation, a decision that'll have dire consequences later. The objective of the bombing was clear: create chaos. While the civilian population wasn't to be explicitly targeted, the attack was aimed at creating panic amongst them. It's also important to point out that there were thousands of refugees in the city, which would certainly further this goal. That, along with the bombing of infrastructure, would help create the conditions to help facilitate the Soviet advance. The British airman, Miles Tripp, who partook in the bombing, recalls that the operation reminded him of the German invasion of France, where the bombing of towns done by the Luftwaffe caused a flood of refugees that hindered the Allied response. Dresden was not the only city to be targeted that night. Similar raids were to be conducted on the German cities of Nuremberg, Bonn, Leipzig, and Magdeburg. This whole operation would involve a whopping 1,400 aircraft from the RAF alone, not to mention the 311 American B-17s that were to only attack Dresden. With the war being so close to its end, many people have made a fuss about the necessity of this raid when the war was seemingly over. To reference Cuntface again, right on the back of his book, he specifically states that there were only 12 weeks till Germany's capitulation. However, you have to realize that Germany had no intent of surrendering. By 1945, it was obvious to everyone that Germany had lost, yet the inbred Austrian refused to believe it, instead sending old men and children to die on the front lines while he cowered away in his bunker. Even so, not everyone in Germany wanted to surrender, specifically on the Eastern Front, where news of Soviet war crimes scared the living shit out of them. The only way to defeat Germany was, as we saw, to flush every single Nazi out of their mother's basement, till victory.
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them. At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and half 100 other places, they put that rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
Listen, I know I've been cracking jokes and providing context to justify what's to come. While I fully believe that the bombing of Dresden was justified, that doesn't change the fact that a lot of civilians, including children, died in very horrific ways. As I said at the end of my Pinochet video, it may be easy to look at the numbers and compare them to others, but at the end of the day, every single one of them is a person with a name, a face, and a story. Sure, they were contributing to the Nazi war effort, and perhaps they were even stupid for following Hitler, but in the end, the deaths of civilians are always a tragedy. On the night of the 13th of February, 1945, hundreds of Lancasters took off from their airfields in Britain, with their sights set on Dresden. While flying over Germany, they dropped pieces of metal called windows to confuse the enemy's radars. At 9:40 p.m., the city's sirens began to sound the alarm, and, on the radio, the broadcasters informed the population about the coming danger. Attention, attention, Anglo-American bombers are approaching Dresden. Head to your air raid shelters immediately. For the non-Germans of the city, they had their own shelters separated from the rest. Kurt Vonnegut and several other Allied POWs took shelter in a butchery referred to as Slaughterhouse 5 alongside the corpses of dead animals. But at the very least, they were rather safe. Victor and Eva Klemperer, along with the rest of Dresden's surviving Jews, were forced to take shelter in half-buried basements that provided little protection. The first aircraft to reach the city were British Mosquitoes, flying low and popping flares to mark their targets. Following closely, the 244 Lancasters of the first wave were about to reach their targets. AA fire had been very limited, as most of the German guns had been sent to the front. What was left was pitiful and was largely crewed by teenagers. At 10:03 p.m., the first bombs began to drop on the city. The first to fall were meant to demolish the buildings, or, at the very least, open them up to the elements. The second were incendiary munitions, which were meant to travel through the blown-out roofs of damaged buildings, igniting the interiors. The shelters where people hid began to shake, and the power occasionally cut out, leaving them in darkness. In case of fire, many people brought with them buckets of water and wet blankets to combat the flames. The area surrounding the train station was the site of some of the night's worst moments of the bombing. Aside from being hit, there were many refugees whom took shelter in the station's tunnels. People began to panic, and there was even a little stampede at the tunnel entrance that ended up killing dozens. As I'm sure most of you are aware, the firestorm caused by the bombing was intense, burning as bright as day. The authorities had constructed many water tanks in preparation for this, with the most notable of them being in the Altmarkt. However, this still wasn't enough to stop the flames. The 244 Lancasters had dropped a total of 880 tons of bombs on Dresden. 57% of them were explosives, while the remaining 43% were incendiary. 15 minutes after the first bombs dropped, the air raid sirens went off, and people crawled out of their shelters to witness the attack that had just unfolded. Miška Danos, a Lithuanian who had moved to Dresden during the war, observed how the city lit up in flames from an old AA position just outside of the city. With so many people having been injured, Albert Fohm and his colleagues from the Friedrichstadt Hospital worked tirelessly to treat the wounded. As expected, most injuries consisted of burns from the fire and eye damage from the smoke. While the destruction was devastating, most of it was contained to the city center by the Altstadt. Many exhausted people simply went home and hopped into bed. But little did they know, the night was far from over. From within the safety of their bunker by the Elbe River, the civilian authorities had received a shocking warning. Another wave was coming. An additional 552 Lancasters were now approaching the city. From 3,000 kilometers in the air, Miles Tripp observed the burning remains of Dresden. Feeling like enough damage had been done, he waited till his Lancaster passed over the city, hoping to drop his bombs in a nearby field. However, it's very likely that they still caused damage. Since the previous wave had cut the power lines, most of the air raid sirens didn't work, and the authorities were forced to run around the city with hand sirens to warn people. This additional and much larger attack further destroyed the city. The fire only continued to spread, and many people were caught out in the open. In some places, the heat was so intense that hair and clothing would catch fire. Even the shoes that people wore would melt on the hot pavement, causing many to fall over and succumb to the flames. As mentioned previously, the air raid shelters in Dresden lacked proper ventilation, causing many people to suffocate. If the lack of oxygen didn't kill you, there was a chance that the shelters could get incredibly hot, basically turning into ovens hot enough to cook you alive. In desperation, those caught out in the open jumped into the water tanks meant to help extinguish the flames, but even that didn't help. Over by the Altmarkt, the water in the tanks had gone down significantly. With no way to get out, those who jumped in there for safety ended up drowning. In another tank, the water had gotten so hot that it boiled everyone to death. Throughout the night, the city continued to burn, and people continued to die. In the morning of the next day, the extent of the damage could finally be observed. The initial estimate for the death toll was 3,000, but considering this was only a few hours after the attack, it was very inaccurate. Lacking a stable supply of water and electricity, Dr. Fromm and his team were unable to treat the many victims of the bombing. The military began to work with the aid workers to evacuate the injured out of the city to receive treatment elsewhere. As the Germans tried to recover from the attack, a new threat loomed over the horizon. A third wave of bombers, this time American, were closing in. A total of 311 B-17s arrived around midday. Not as much as the last attack, but still quite threatening. Their objective was a train station in Friedrichstadt. It is here, at the end of the attack, that Mr. Cuntface makes an interesting claim. In his book, he says that Mustang fighter aircraft began strafing refugees who were fleeing Dresden. While you may think to yourself that this sounds absolutely stupid, you'd be surprised to hear that this claim may have some merit. There were many people in Dresden who claimed that this happened, however this may have been just a result of confusion. As Sinclair Mckay puts it, there were most likely German aircraft observing the situation and, out of instinct and fear, the civilians ducked down for cover, believing them to be Allied aircraft. On top of that, I find it unlikely that Mustangs would go there just to strafe civilians when they have more important things to do. For the next few days, the people of Dresden would have to deal with the aftermath of the raid. Martial law was declared and anyone caught looting would be shot. But the worst of their worries would be the thousands of dead bodies lying in the streets and in the basements. Burying them all proved difficult, so instead they resorted to cremation. To assist in the recovery of dead bodies, Allied POWs, including Kurt Vonnegut, were forced to help. Vonnegut and the others were mostly tasked with retrieving the bodies that were stuck in the air raid shelters. Because of this, they were sometimes referred to as body miners. Many of those who had died in these bunkers did so due to suffocation, while others had been cooked alive. Most disturbing of all was that some of them had apparently melted, as when the body miners went in, they were often greeted by pools of bloody fluid. Sometimes the bodies would rip apart when they tried to remove them, others were simply stuck under the rubble. It didn't take long for flies and rats to start festering on the dead. With the risk of disease high, some basements filled with corpses were simply incinerated with flamethrowers. Dresden would not know peace for a long time. On the 15th, a force of US bombers set out to attack the hydrogen plant in the city of Leipzig, and they were told that if it was too cloudy, they would head to Dresden and attack the rail infrastructure there. When they reached Dresden, their targets were obstructed by the large amount of smoke that was caused by the firestorm. As a result, many of their bombs fell off target. The raid was much less impressive compared to what came before. In fact, many people didn't even know that there was a raid to begin with, and those who did were simply more concerned with dealing with the dead. As the Red Army came closer, concentration camp victims were forced to march west. Many of them passed by the remains of Dresden. According to one of these survivors, they noticed that the morale of their guards was low and, after seeing the burning ruins of Dresden, gave them the strength to carry on and survive the war till its end.
When the storm bursts over Germany, they will look back to the days of Lübeck and Rostock and Cologne, as a man caught in the blasts of a hurricane will look back to the gentle zephyrs of last summer. It may take a year, it may take two, but for the Nazis, the writing is on the wall. Let them look out for themselves. The cure is in their own hands.
For the Allies, the raid was a large success. Since the city had been bombed so intensely, its largest factories were put out of action, and the raid certainly generated a level of chaos. However, Dresden's rail infrastructure, which was a key target, saw some light repairs done to it, reconnecting communications with Berlin and Prague. Though it did take them a few days, and only a limited number of trains could use the lines. To address the topic of morale, no, it did not cripple the Germans' will to fight. On the 7th of May, Dresden fell to the Red Army after a brief battle. The Red Army, being the Red Army, got up to typical Red Army things such as rape and looting. You can only imagine what it was like for the remaining women of the city. As we all know, none of this stuff is very relevant, as the main focus has been the drama that came afterwards. Words such as terror bombing have been used by the British press and Parliament, giving the raid some notoriety amongst the public. Then there of course was the Nazi response. Just a few days after, Joseph Goebbels claimed that 250,000 people perished in the bombing, though some propaganda sources say it was 350,000. Now, I'm going to assume that most of you watching this video have at least 2 brain cells to rub together and can process why this claim is bullshit. Regardless of the death toll, the destruction of cities is always going to be something horrific. As already mentioned, the Soviets used it as propaganda, and the mass bombing of nations became tied to the Vietnam War, which, as you know, was not very popular. And then came along Mr. Cuntface. In his book, published in 1963, that has so many red flags in it, I'm genuinely astonished that it took them so long to oust him as a Holocaust denier. Irving claims that between 100 and 35,000 people were killed in the attack. Apparently, he would later lower the death toll to between 50,000 and 100,000 in later editions of his book. However, I can't personally confirm this. So, where did he get his sources from? Well, Irving got his sources from Hans Voigt, who got it from the Dresden police chief. However, there is just one big problem, and that is that Hans Voigt would later state in court that he had based these numbers off of rumors, most likely originating from propaganda. So, how many people actually died in the bombing of Dresden? Well, back in 2004, a team of German historians were commissioned by the city of Dresden and began working on uncovering the truth. After 5 years of research, they finally published their findings. The results of the investigations carried out by the commission found that up to 25,000 people were killed in the air raids on Dresden from February 13th to the 15th, 1945. They were able to determine this by collecting burial records, interviewing eyewitnesses, examining fire reports, and ground surveys covering the 13 square miles of the city that were destroyed. They were also very adamant that there was no proof or serious indication that the 25,000 number was incorrect. Even though the extreme claims made by Nazi propaganda, and later parroted by Irving, are complete bullshit, that doesn't change the fact that what the people of Dresden went through was horrific. Is bombing cities bad? Yes. Can Dresden be considered a war crime? Probably. But you would have to be a whole different breed of stupid to use this to portray Nazi Germany as the victims. If you don't want to get bombed, then maybe don't start a war of extermination. While the bombing of Dresden didn't single-handedly win the Allies of the war, it was the sum of the whole campaign that hindered Germany's ability to fight. Ultimately, it was the civilian populations from the globe, including Germany, that suffered from the decisions made by one of the worst regimes in history.